Hey, so I'm a game developer with a commercial game, and I've been aggressively prototyping my next game. And I think I realized how to make a killer mechanic. It's actually very simple, and it's applicable to any stage of development that you're currently in. Now, this is backed up with a lot of research and design philosophies by experts themselves. So we're going to go ahead and break it down. But first, let's observe this little video here, right? Or this clip. You can see on the left, we have a very basic movement system, which we just basically move up and down, left and right. And on the right, you can see that suddenly movement becomes way more critical. And I'm going to ask you a question very quickly. What do you think makes this compelling? What is the response to why this is actually a little bit like, hey, this is a little bit more interesting than usual? And the answer is very simple. It's risk. And we're going to talk a lot about risk in this video, so with a lot of examples and such. But the thing about risk is that it's something that doesn't have to be done. But if you do engage in the risk, you have the possibility of engaging in a reward. And so in a classic push and pull philosophy that Masahiro Sakurai talks about, it's very simple to say, hey, every game mechanic should have a risk and a reward associated to it. And while this is intuitive and makes a lot of sense on paper, what actually makes any mechanic killer, or what makes any mechanic just 10 times better, is when you exaggerate the risk way more than you think. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to make a heavier risk. On the other hand, you do have to apply two other layers to the risk. So, compiling all the data and research that I've been doing recently, I made this chart, and I'm going to go ahead and break it down and show off some examples going back and forth. So we'll go ahead and get back to this, but we're going to slowly discover that when we're talking about risk and reward, there's more to it than it seems. So, first of all, what type of mechanic are we going to make, right? If we're going to go ahead and make a game and determine the genre and what idea we want to make, it comes down to making a list of possible game mechanics that we want to engage in and such. And so the first step is, hey, let's just describe the mechanic that we want. Followed by that, you should really ask yourself the purpose behind the mechanic. Is this going to actually be the main core mechanic that helps the game and everything, or is this more like a supportive feature or idea? And remember, as a developer, the more mechanics you have, the more scope you will have. So you always want to use this thing called via negativa, which is basically the concept of, hey, reduce as much as possible, because at its simplest form, you end up having more effectivity. So that being said, you can have a bunch of mechanics in your game, but it's very recommended to kind of just minimize it as much as possible. One other thing that I think is extremely important is the appeal. And this doesn't necessarily mean if the mechanic's going to be popular or something that resonates with a lot of people. This is more about the synthesis of if your mechanic is aligned with your game. So, for example, if you're making a shooter, you probably want to have a lot of shooting mechanics. If you're going to make a card game, you probably also want to have a lot of card game mechanics. Now, you are allowed to mix and match these genres and concepts together, and there's nothing really wrong with that. What we do advise is, hey, if you are able to align the mechanic with the genre that your players are expecting to play, you're going to create more flow. And flow is just another fancy word of saying, hey, I'm going to have a kind of like a stable enjoyment and just really understand that, like I'm going to have my ups, my downs, but I'm going to expect these type of things. So again, in a design phase, there's really no wrong answer to what type of mechanic you're going to be applying and what type of purpose. But we do have to get to the conversation of, the whole like risk and reward stuff that we'll get to. So for the rest of the video, I'm going to go ahead and use these three games as an example of like how we can continue building this chart, right? So for example, purpose is, hey, what are we making? The first game is the bullet hell. The second game is Halo's flight mechanic. And the third game is going to be talking about Smash Bros. Up a B. So what is the purpose of the bullet hell game? Well, we're going to have these like powerful attacks using weapons. What is the purpose of having a vehicle in Halo? We get to fly. And what is the purpose of the up B in Smash Bros? It's to recover to the stage. Okay, so does that appeal with the actual genre that each game is exploring themselves on? And the answer is typically going to be yes. With bullet hells, we're going to have weapons. With flying, it's a multiplayer shooter, so it kind of makes sense that you have these vehicle options, and the vehicle itself is technically a weapon as well. And with Smash Bros, what's really interesting about this is that Smash Bros is actually a platformer and a fighter, also known as a platformer fighter game. But what's interesting is that recovery is a motion option. So technically it falls more into the platforming side of things. That being said, you can see that the synthesis of recovering to the stage relies more on the platformer. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to strictly be a platforming type of mechanic. It can be something else, and that's totally fine. But you can see that it just adds to the flow of things. So now we're going to talk about the most important part of this entire design concept, which is the challenge category. This is where you enable your risks, and this is where you enable the difficulties of expressing the mechanic. What we're basically aiming to do here is, hey, I want to design the mechanic so that the player is actually compelled to not use the mechanic. And that sounds controversial. That sounds weird. And, why would I make something that I don't want the player to actually deal with, right? And we'll get into that psychological reason in a second. But the first thing is, for every mechanic you build, you have to have a counter-forcing mechanic, as well as in like a counter-forcing obstacle. So if you jump, what's the counter force of a jump? A gravity, right? So it's something that's going to push you down. In other words, if we look at the examples again, right? Let's say in my bullet hell, I decide to take this like giant cannon, right? Well, now I'm carrying the weapon, and I think it would make sense if the counterforce is, hey, what if I'm slower? What if my mobility is, like decreased? What if I am just naturally a sluggish player? In Halo, if you're driving a vehicle, when you crash, you actually take massive damage. So you kind of have that intuition of, well, I'm flying, but I want to make sure I don't crash, which sounds obvious, but that's the counterbalance. Because if there was no counter force for flying, then flying would be free, and then like it wouldn't really be as compelling, which we'll get to in a second. And then with Smash Bros, when you recover, you actually get to disable your attacks, depending on the character in this case, right? But for the most part, you're not allowed to do any other attacks. Once you use up B, you're just kind of like vulnerable in that state, and that's basically your opposition. This is the first step of writing your push and pull, which again was established by Masahiro Sakurai himself, right? So we have our mechanic and we have our counter force. Well, what else do we need to add? This is where we add mechanical polarity. This is very simple to do. All it's saying is, hey, what is your mechanic's weakness or shortcoming? Take that and elevate it. Make it worse. Make it harder. Make it more difficult for the player to actually want to engage in the mechanic, which controversial. It's like, why would I want to do that? But we'll get to that in a second. Quick interruption. So I just really want to make sure that you guys understand that the reason why polarity is so important is because it actually means that you're not average. Average just basically means, hey, we're expecting this, and this is like whatever. Like, you don't stand out. But polarity is basically saying by making things worse, you make the opposite better. And this is the reason why we're doing mechanical polarity in the first place. Like, we're just adding more onto the risk to continue adding to the reward. Back to the video. Right? So let's say with my giant cannon that I'm walking around with pretty slowly and everything, let's say I want to actually use the cannon. Well, I'm going to have to charge the attack to actually use it. So now I'm spending time to actually get ready to use the weapon. Okay, I'm not really compelled to use the mechanic because that's like a lot of like I'm slow and now I got to charge. Okay, maybe I don't want to do this, right? In Halo's flight mechanic, for example, did you know that if you crash really hard, you take not only massive damage, but you actually eject from the pilot seat? You basically lose the ability to, use the vehicle. And if you have any shields or any sorts of health, you automatically drop to like 1 HP, or you're about to like, the zone or range where you get killed very easily. And finally, in Smash Bros, when you do recover, you're vulnerable. Your ability to use up B again, or the damage output, is reduced, as in it gets stalled, and you can't air dodge. What do you call it? You can't air dodge. You can't shield in the air. And more importantly, depending on the character as well, you lose air drift, meaning the movement that you have in the horizontal plane as you're jumping just kind of becomes more rigid after you use up B. Well, that kind of just means that this mechanic's kind of like not horrendous, but it's difficult, right? It's just more. I'm getting more reasons not to use it. And then we finally finish this challenge category with the final part, which is the actual risk. And so risk is going to be the possible punishment that the player receives for performing incorrectly, or not using the mechanic correctly. So in our feature, we already talked about opposition. We talked about how do we make that opposition or that shortcoming way more elevated. And now we have to talk about possible punishments, meaning after the player engages with this entire feature, what could possibly go wrong after doing that? And so going back to the cannon example, I'm slow, I'm vulnerable because now I have to charge the attack. But let's say I shoot and I miss. All of that for nothing, right? I probably spent 5 seconds being very vulnerable and just kind of like sluggish and everything just to miss. My punishment would be missing. In Halo, you could actually just straight up die. You can lose a bunch of health. But also, if you were playing, I believe, the Juggernaut or any other class that has like more defenses and such, it doesn't matter how many shields you have. You just automatically lose all your shields when you crash. Okay, that sucks. And in Smash Bros, if you can't recover and if you do it incorrectly, you lose the stock, which means you could also lose the game. Wow, why would I want to engage with these mechanics? And this is where the reward comes in. You see, the heavier the risk is, the more appealing the reward is going to be once you actually get to avoid the risk. In other words, the reward itself doesn't actually have to be an actual reward. You don't have to reward your player with anything. The reward could just be, hey, you didn't fail using the mechanic, therefore you should feel relief. However, it is important to reward the player. And so there's another reason for that. But first, we need to talk about why we need to reward the player in the first place. Because now, if they're able to gain something out of this entire exchange, they're more compelled to enter the interaction. That being said, let's go ahead and look at our, our opposition, our polarity, our risks, but let's look at the rewards. I talked about this heavy cannon that has like a bunch of bad things going for it, but if I actually land the attack, I'm probably doing a bunch of damage. I have like this giant bullet that's just like destroying the crowd. It has like a bunch of, damage output and everything. So my reward is doing a lot of damage. Okay, I'll take that. If I maintain safety in the vehicle and fly everywhere and dodge all the things and, not really worry about it, I'm basically rewarded with extreme mobility when I'm flying the Banshee in Halo. That's pretty cool. I also have, the ability to do spin rolls. I can start shooting enemies. I can access secret areas. So I think it's a great idea to pick up the vehicle if I know that that's going to be my reward. And lastly, with Smash Bros, well, if I don't use the mechanic, I'm going to go ahead and die, right? But if I return to the stage, that means I can continue battling and, keep playing the game. I think that's a nice reward. Okay, so like we talked about, it's not that you're making the risk heavier, it's that you're adding layers to the risk. And the two extra layers that we were talking about is literally going to be your opposition and polarity. And so what's interesting about this is that the heavier or the more intense your, weight of like challenges, the more interesting or the more dynamic your reward is going to be. And so again, you could have any type of reward, but it's the fact that the value of the reward isn't what you actually do. It's actually just you avoiding all of this like heavy negative consequences that you don't want to like deal with, right? So the thing about this interesting concept that Sakurai talks about is, hey, yeah, we can give you risk and reward. That's kind of fundamental, but what if there's an exploit? What if there's some special circumstance where maybe the player doesn't really want to engage in those risks anymore? Like they understand the reward, but once you attain something, you probably know how to get it, or you probably just don't want to keep attaining the same thing over and over again. In other words, the reward may become stale and may become boring. How do we fix that? And so this is where the progress comes in. This is known as progression. And what it basically means is, hey, every single time your player does something that gains a reward, you need to make sure that they're getting a return of investment. And I think the best example for this is going to be Pokemon, for example, right? So if the mechanic is battling, right, you battle and the risk is, hey, what if I like lose, or I lose my team, my Pokemon? Okay, the normal stuff, right? But when you win a battle, the reward is actually just progression, meaning, hey, I beat the trainer, I can fight the next trainer, and this and that. But the actual source of progression is going to be EXP, and in this case, currency, right? But the reason why EXP is so important is because you're basically training your Pokemon to get stronger as you fight. So, for example, I have a Dino, right, or Dano, and if I gain enough EXP to reach level 50, I get Zoelis. The change from Dino to Zoelis is I have more stats, I have access to new moves, I basically have the ability to do more damage, and I'm basically rewarded for playing with Dino for an extended period amount of time. And if I continue to do this until I reach level 64, I get Hydreigon. So the progression source of this is literally just EXP. The more EXP I get, the more I'm, progressing. And notice I didn't change anything. I'm still a Pokemon. I'm still battling. I'm still doing the normal things. All I'm doing is gaining more access to my tool. So now I go from this weak Dano into Hydreigon that gets a new ability. It gets arguably like one of the best stats in the game, like really good stuff, right? So the idea behind this is, okay, avoid the risk. You get the reward. Continuously do this loop over and over again and feed the player something that allows them to understand that what they're doing is progressing towards a goal. This could be EXP, leveling up. This could be unlockables. This could be a bunch of things. And so you do this, and now you have something that incentivizes the player to react and interact with your mechanic almost as often as possible. And now you have a very compelling mechanic. But there's one more layer that you can add to make this mechanic used even more, and it's called depth. And depth is actually extremely interesting and actually very easy to add, because all depth really is adding one or more extra possible outcome when using your feature. So for example, if I'm talking about the heavy cannon example, right? What if I told you, hey, when I'm holding the weapon, I'm actually going to gain a defensive buff that multiplies all my stats by 1.1. Meaning, okay, I have the weapon because logically I'm holding it, I'm slow or whatever, but now if I take damage, I'm just going to take slightly less damage than usual when I'm holding the weapon. Interesting, because this means now I have an extra way to use, the carry mechanic where I'm just carrying the weapon and such. But when you think about it that way, well, I know the risks, I know the reward, but I can also use this for a different direction. And the thing about depth is that you don't change anything about the mechanic. We're still talking about the same, holding your weapon and everything. All you're doing is saying, hey, I now have this little bonus that I can do, or I have this extra output that I can have. This little layer causes depth. With Halo, when you're flying and everything, again, you have access to a spin roll. But did you know that the spin roll is actually a static momentum movement? Meaning, if you're about to crash and if you use the spin roll into the wall, you actually don't take that much damage. In fact, you kind of avoid the entire risk as a whole. And so now wait a minute, I can now fly, find these areas, attack my enemies, do spin rolls, dodge, do all these cool things. But now I also have the ability to use the same mechanic of flying to my advantage to minimize risks. And now I have like another layer of gameplay by using the exact same mechanic, which is the vehicle of flying. Okay, interesting. And in Smash Bros, we're talking about recovery. We're talking about how it is a motion, like it's related to platforming and everything. But the recovery is literally an attack. It's a tool. You can still literally directly damage your opponent in front of you as you use up B and deal damage to them. Now, there are consequences to using up B in the middle of the stage. Maybe it's a little bit more risky, this and that, but that doesn't take away from the fact that you're still doing the same thing, an upwards motion that does damage. We didn't change anything. We just gave you the extra option to operate with it. So when you have that in mind, you basically have this, like, again, this graph that I compiled that I called, hey, this is how you make the mechanics and such, right? I think the real key to all of this really comes down to the challenge category, which again talks about all the risks that you have to really avoid. The compelling category is, again, what allows the player to keep going back and forth. And the investment category is just why they should continue going forward, right? So again, progression gives you EXP, could give you like more reasons to achieve a goal. But depth is just that curiosity of, oh, well, I could also use this to achieve the other goal that I have in mind. And so if we go back to this little, graph here, we talked about risks and rewards. So you really just want to make sure that the risk is extremely heavy, that it's really taxing, that it's really disastrous if you mess up. And that's okay. And that your reward should be good. It should be something that actually rewards the player and makes them feel good and such. But the key here is to make sure that you're actually letting them progress. Meaning the more times they achieve that reward over and over again, they now have another level of reward that they can have. It could be the same thing. It could be extra stats. It could be more power. It could be a bajillion things. All you want to do is continue to let the player, be rewarded for investing in your game at the end of the day. That's literally what it all does. So if you can create a mechanic that adheres to these rules correctly, you basically have a killer mechanic. And the reason why I think this is such a good philosophy here is because it's really applicable to any idea that you have. It could be movement, it could be attacks, it could be dodging, it could be trading, collecting. There's any mechanic you have in mind. All you have to do is just continuously add onto the opposition and mechanical polarity aspect of it, and then again the progression of actually rewarding your player, and you have a killer mechanic. One more example of progression that's very important is the one that I'm going to demonstrate here from Dodge King, known as the dodge streak system, which basically means right before you're about to take damage, if you move, that basically counts as a dodge, and you get points for that. If you're able to chain points over and over, you end up leveling up, and the consequence of doing that is allowing you to increase your attack, gain an upgrade, and basically level the playing field with other robots that you're fighting. You don't have to take this route, though. You can actually just continuously dodge, or not even attempt to dodge, and just play it super safe. You can go up to robots, do neutral attacks, but the consequence of not engaging in the mechanic is you simply never expressing a higher level of power, never attaining other upgrades, and simply kind of like falling behind when enemies do eventually get tougher and have harder patterns to dodge from and everything. So what I really want to exaggerate here as well is that a very well-placed mechanic that has a really good progression system is that there are both consequences for using and not using said mechanic. So if my feature says dodge, then I should reward the player for doing that. If my player completely never wants to dodge at all, they can still play the game completely fair. However, there will be consequences for that. So that's when you know that your progression style, or like whatever you design for progression, works when it has consequences for both using it and not using it. So hey, let's say you already, you're prototyping a game. Maybe you're in the middle of your game development right now, and you just want to kind of reassess some of your, mechanics at the moment. And you might be asking, hey, like, I understand this, but maybe I don't have that much polarity. Maybe I don't have that many negatives in my current mechanic. And so I have a couple of examples that you can go ahead and use. And again, this is super easy, right? It could be very little things such as stats. It could be your ammo. It could be how you move, your weight, your gravity, all of these things, not a big deal. It could be very intricate. You can introduce, doing self-damage, doing having status effects, maybe being more vulnerable, lingering into other combos and such. So like there's a bunch of things that you can do, right? But what I want to share here today is, this is the little chart that I designed and such. Again, a lot of inspiration comes from a lot of research, thanks to Masahiro Sakurai and other developers that have been contributing as well. But I also do want to say that I made a worksheet that you can go ahead and download for free and just go ahead and use whenever you want. And it basically talks about all the things that we just discussed here, which is your mechanics, the purpose, opposition, mechanical polarity, risk, reward, progress, depth, appeal. And you can just go ahead and kind of like fill it in, ask yourself, like, is this going to work? Maybe I should assess this. Oh, my mechanic actually doesn't have that much of a risk. Oh, my mechanic has a reward, but it could be better. So it's just a little instruction guide where you just, put your answers in, kind of read the instructions a little bit more to see like, okay, what do I need to do to evaluate this? And yeah, so I hope this really helps. And I'm asking you to go ahead and continue making a compelling game. So good luck.